Chapter 1. The wound that hungers there was a time when the Force breathed evenly, unbroken by ambition, untouched by the poison of desire. In that forgotten age, the stars turned slowly, and the Jedi sang the song of light across the galaxy, binding worlds in sacred order. But even then, even in the heart of purity, there was a crack, a hairline fracture in the light, and from it the darkness seeped, not as rage, but as hunger, a hunger not for chaos, but for truth, for the Force. As it was before morality, before restraint, the Sith did not begin as monsters. They began as seekers. Long before the name Sith darkened the breath of sentience, there were Jedi who listened too closely to the Force and heard not harmony, but power. They questioned the ancient code. Why peace when passion stirred more deeply? Why serenity when anger gave speed to the blade? Why restraint when freedom burned brighter than obedience? They broke away not in hatred, but in yearning for fire, for meaning, for a power untouched by doctrine. These were the first dark Jedi, and their fall did not come with a scream. It came with a whisper, soft as blood on stone. The 100-year darkness was born not from one traitor, but from many. The galaxy, shaped by order, recoiled. The Jedi hunted their own. Armies clashed on forgotten worlds, and the Force itself howled. When the war ended, the survivors of the broken creed fled into the void. There they found a forgotten people, an ancient warrior race, steeped in raw primal force, the Sith species. The exiles did not conquer them. They ruled through awe, through power. The Dark Jedi became gods, and the Sith their worshippers. In time, they took the name as their own, not a species, a destiny. From this unholy union, the Sith Empire was born, and for centuries it grew in silence, far beyond the republics. Graphs, in hidden systems, they built temples of obsidian and bone. They carved teachings into the skin of slaves. They wrapped truth in chains and called it freedom. The dark side was no longer a philosophy, it was a religion of conquest. But they were too many, too proud, too thirsty. They did not understand. That power shared is power diminished. And so their empire fell, not to the Jedi, but to itself. It began with betrayal. It ended with extinction. They tore each other apart, master against apprentice, apprentice against brother. Each Sith desired dominion over all, and so none could rule. Civil war raged like a virus. Planets burned. The stars themselves seemed to blink in sorrow. What few survived fled into deeper shadows, each believing they alone deserved the galaxies. Throne the Sith became plague rather than people, a disease without cure, a hunger without host. The Force, wounded and trembling, whispered to one, Darth Bane. He was not born to greatness, he was born to pain. A minor son on Apatros, beaten and forgotten, but the Force sang to him. It called to his rage, his hatred, his clarity. He rose through the Sith ranks not with cunning, but with fury. Yet even in his ascent, he saw the ruin in their numbers. He saw that the dark side devours all who stand near it, and that the only way to wield it was alone. From the shattered ruins of the Sith Brotherhood, Bane alone emerged with vision, a vision not of empire, but of endurance. He went to Lehon, to the tombs of ancient tyrants. He broke into the holocron of Darth Revan, who had danced between light and dark, truth and madness. And in that dead whisper, he found the law, the rule of two, one to embody the power, one to crave it, a sacred wound passed from soul to soul, a chain of destruction so pure it would survive the galaxies, forgetting a lineage of predators, each devouring the one before, growing more perfect with every generation. Not armies, not fleets, ideas, hatred refined into precision. The Sith would no longer scream, they would whisper. He destroyed the Brotherhood, killed them all in a storm of thought and fire. The Jedi, believing the Sith extinct, let their guard fall. But Bane did not wish for war. He wished for survival. He found an apprentice, a child of pain, like himself. He fed her lies. He fed her truth. She became Darth Sana, and the ritual began. But even in that moment of clarity, even in Bane's dark genius, the wound pulsed, it hungered. For every rule there is disobedience. For every master, a future traitor. The rule of two was not a solution. It was a sacrifice, a living ritual fed by blood and betrayal. One would always kill the other. One would always burn brighter, and that brightness would always fall to shadow. For 1,000 years they lived like this, unseen, unknown, undying, a secret war of inheritance. They embedded themselves in governments, in cultures, in bloodlines, a great work of darkness, invisible to the Jedi. While the Republic festered, the Sith refined. The rule of two became more than survival. It became design, until at last, in the dying days of the Republic, the final apprentice was chosen. Not a Sith born of rage, but one born of silence, of masks, of planning so intricate it bordered on prophecy. His name was Sidious, and somewhere, in a desert world of slavery and starlight, a child was being born. A child not of accident, but perhaps of intent. A child with no father, a vessel created or foretold. A boy who would bring balance, or destruction. The rule of two had shaped the galaxy in shadow, but soon it would shape it in fire. The wound hungers still. Chapter 2. The whisper of Darth Banehay did not begin as a lord. He began as dust, flesh broken beneath mining drills. On the grey world of Apatow, a name forgotten by his father, a boy shaped by violence. Dessel, that was the name that once held him in chains. But the Force whispered through his pain, not as comfort, but as promise. And when he struck back, when blood stained his fists, and the bones of his enemies shattered beneath his wrath, the dark side opened its eye and watched. For this boy was not born to obey. He was born to end. He fled to the Sith, carrying hatred like a second skin. They took him in, fed him power, sharpened his will. But even as he rose in the Sith Brotherhood, he saw them for what they were, diluted, fractured, weak. They spoke of strength, but squabbled like starved dogs. Dozens of lords, all calling themselves dark, each jealous of the next. Their unity was illusion, their brotherhood a blasphemy. Dessel became Bane not in rank, but in revelation. He saw that the Sith had not survived the wars with the Jedi. They had only lingered, diseased by democracy and crowd, and then the Force spoke to him. Not in words, but in visions of fire. He left the academy, journeyed into ruins long forgotten. He walked the valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, dust swirling beneath dead stars, tombs breathing with the memory of monsters. There, among the stone coffins of Darth Revan, Marka Ragnos and Nagasado, he listened. The ancient holocrons sang to him, not of conquest, but of purpose. Revan, the fallen Jedi who had once mastered both light and shadow, whispered what? All others had forgotten that the dark side is not for all. It is for one. Bane drank deep from the holocron's mind. He consumed Revan's teachings like a sacred poison. He saw the truth. The Sith had died because they were many. They had waged war like beasts. But the dark side did not want numbers. It wanted purity. Power should not be spread. It should be concentrated. One to embody the power, one to crave it. That was the sacred wound, the law beyond all law. It was not peace. It was not order. It was death, passed like flame from hand to hand. Bane returned to the Brotherhood not as student, but as death. He crafted a ritual drawn from the deepest alchemical arts. He manipulated the Brotherhood into unleashing the thought bomb, a wave of destruction that consumed every Sith and Jedi caught within it. Lords turned to ash, spirits torn from flesh, knowledge lost in screams. Ruusan became a graveyard of ghosts, and when the smoke cleared, only one Sith remained, Darth Bane, the last, the first, the wound that would never close. From this silence he built his doctrine. He would take an apprentice, not a soldier, but a vessel, a child who would learn and one day kill him. This was the truth few could bear. The Sith do not grow through love. They grow through murder. The apprentice does not replace the master through loyalty. They do so through betrayal. The rule of two was not a chain. It was a blade, and both must bleed. He found her on a shattered world. Rain fell like daggers, and in the mud stood a girl with eyes like carved obsidian. Zana, she was unformed, but her hate was clean. He took her, molded her, lied to her, gave her truth. He taught her to twist the Force into sorcery, to infect minds and bend flesh, and in her he saw his future death. He rejoiced, for the death of a Sith Lord by the hand of his apprentice was not tragedy, it was fulfillment. The Jedi, blind and gasping from the war's ruin, believed the Sith extinct. Their temples mourned the lost. Their archives marked the Brotherhood's fall as the end. But beneath their blindness, Bane smiled. He had no need for armies, no need for temples. His temple was within, a temple built in memory, in blood, in secrecy. He and Zana vanished into shadow, not to hide, but to wait. Generations would pass. The Jedi would grow soft. The Republic would grow bloated. And the Sith, reduced to two, would become perfect. Each apprentice trained in silence, taught to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast their master. Each master grown strong enough to resist death until they could no longer. The Force was now a razor, and each wielder sharpened it further. And yet, beneath this cold law, there was something deeper, a darkness, not of fire, but of stillness. The rule of two was not merely practical, it was ritual. A repeating death meant to feed the Force itself, to scar it, to reshape it. Each generation of Sith carved their hatred into the fabric of reality. Each apprentice was a wound passed from generation to generation, never healing, always festering. Bane aged, his body rotted, even as his mind endured. He sought ways to cheat death, rituals, hosts, transference of essence. But Zana watched. And when the time came, when his desperation made him vulnerable, she struck. Their battle was silent, hidden from history. But in the end, one lived, and one became memory. The rule endured. Centuries passed, names faded, but the rule did not. Darth Cognos, Darth Millennial, Darth Vectivus, each shaped the rule in their own reflection. But the law never broke, only two, always two. And with each successor, the dark side grew more focused, more refined, more patient. They buried themselves in the Republic's bones. They whispered into the ears of senators, kings, chancellors, until at last the rule reached a child of Naboo. His name was Sheev Palpatine. He smiled with no teeth, spoke with no voice, wore the mask of civilization, and beneath that mask, the entire rule of two burned like a silent sun. The galaxy thought it knew peace. It had already been conquered. Chapter 3: The Temple. Beneath flesh they speak of temples as stone, as towering halls or sacred ruins bathed in dust and candlelight. But the truest temple of the Sith was never built. It was grown from bone, from memory, from the body of the apprentice. For the rule of two was not merely taught, it was engraved, and to carry its truth was to become its vessel, its altar, its tomb. In the days after Darth Bane's death, if death it was, the rule lived on, not through monuments or declarations, but through pain. Through Darth Zanah. She did not kill him in mercy, she killed him as law. Bane had taught her this, that love is weakness, that reverence is delay. She waited until his flesh was failing, until his madness made him reckless, and then she unspooled her mind into his, not with brute strength, but with poison. A sorceress of deception, Zana cracked him from within. The duel was more than blades, it was inheritance. When she rose from the ashes, there was no celebration, only silence. The quiet of a wound passed from throat to throat. She became the rule, and she did not rest, for she understood what Bane never could. The rule was not enough. A lineage of murder was fragile. If the Jedi discovered even one of them, the line could end. So Zana adapted. She scattered truths into myth. She blurred Sith teachings with forbidden lore, hiding holocrons behind illusions, burying rituals inside false prophecies. Each piece of knowledge was fragmented. Only she held the key to their reassembly. In this way, the Sith would never be destroyed, only forgotten. Her apprentice was a blade sharpened in shadows, Darth Cognos, a hunter of minds, a creature of patience. She learned not through war, but through stillness. Cognos became a sculptor of identity, able to slip through society as whisper, as mask, as nothing. It was she who first saw that power did not require armies or planets, only perception. The galaxy feared fire, but would kneel for fog. Thus began the second phase of the rule. The Sith did not challenge the Jedi. They observed them, they listened. From beneath the floorboards of the Republic, watched its leaders falter, took note of every arrogance, every rot. The Jedi, for all their temples and ranks, were blind to the cancer that coiled just beyond vision. And the Sith smiled. Each new apprentice learned not how to conquer, but how to wait. Darth, millennial, too radical, too ambitious, was cast aside, proving that even among darkness there was discipline. The rule was sacred. No deviations, no heresies. The master must fall, and the apprentice must earn. The lineage grew more precise, each Sith more subtle than the last. Darth Vectivus mastered business. Darth Gravid lost himself in contradictions, attempting to blend light and dark, and was slain for his blasphemy. And the rule endured. Not all apprentices desired truth. Some desired power, but the rule had no mercy. It consumed those who faltered, elevated only the worthy. Over generations, the Sith became more than warriors. They became architects, infiltrators, manipulators of galactic law. Their flesh walked unnoticed, but within them burned 1,000 years of hate. Every cell remembered the slaughter on Rus. Every breath carried the echo of Bane's fury. And in this way, the temple grew, not as a place, but as legacy. The rule of two was now encoded into the Force itself, a ritual that reshaped every Sith who bore it. Their pain was their scripture, their death, their liturgy. But something began to shift. The Masters, once content to pass the flame, began to plan, to reach beyond survival, to imagine not just a return of the Sith, but a dominion eternal. The rule of two had trained them to wait now. They dreamed of what would come after. No longer just two, a galaxy ruled by one voice, one law. One sith. This dream began to stir in Darth Tenebris. He saw the galaxy as a system, one that could be predicted, shaped, controlled. He trained his apprentice not just in the dark side, but in probability, in numbers, in inevitability. That apprentice was called Darth Plagueis, Plagueis the Wise. But wisdom is a lie when spoken by darkness. Plagueis did not merely desire power, he sought dominion over death. The rule of two, to him, was a chrysalis, and he, the one who would break it. He studied midi-chlorians like scripture, experimented on life itself, crafted clones, and whispered to the Force, not as servant, but as master. He did not plan to be replaced. He planned to remain. But even Plagueis, for all his heresies, obeyed. The ritual, he trained a successor. He did not love him. He did not trust him. But he believed he controlled him. He did not. The apprentice watched, listened, smiled, and when Plagueis grew drunk on his delusions, the apprentice struck. Not with a blade, but with wine, with silence, with sleep. The master died unknowing, and a new Sith stood upon his corpse. Darth Sidious. He did not rage, he did not shout, he did not wield his power openly. He wrapped himself in democracy, cloaked his hunger in charm. And beneath his voice, the rule of two trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. For Sidious did not wish to preserve it, he wished to perfect it, to transcend it. He would be the last apprentice. He would become both master and rule, and so he searched, not for a servant, but for a vessel. Somewhere, in the outer rim, a child stirred in the womb of a slave. No father, no past. Only the Force, churning unnaturally around his forming bones. A prophecy twisted through shadow. A chosen one, not born to save the Jedi, but to complete the Sith. The temple of flesh was almost ready, and the wound hungered still. Chapter 4. The fire that consumes the master, the rule of two, is not mercy. It is not lineage. It is not love. It is fire, and it consumes everything it touches. The master is not meant to teach. He is meant to burn. And when the flame has passed, what remains is not a student, but a successor. Each Sith apprentice is trained not to follow, but to survive their master. And when the time is right, when knowledge has hardened into ambition, and ambition into betrayal, the fire is lit. The master must fall, so the rule may rise again. It is this cycle that kept the Sith alive, not in numbers, but in purity. In this crucible of death, weakness was burned away. Each generation more cunning, more dangerous, more hidden than the last. But there was a cost. Every master poured their will into the apprentice, teaching them everything, hoping to delay their own end. But in so doing, they ensured it. For the stronger the apprentice became, the more inevitable the betrayal. The rule of two is not a chain. It is a funeral pyre. Darth Bane believed he would survive his apprentice. He did not. Darth Plagueis believed he could break the cycle. He could not. Even Darth Sidious, whose mastery of the dark side surpassed any before him, understood this truth. He welcomed it, but not as victim, as designer. For Sidious was not content to be master. He intended to remain master, forever. He crafted his apprentices as tools, not heirs. He whispered promises, hid truths, withheld secrets of immortality and essence transfer. His vision was not of succession, but of dominion, endless, unbroken. He would be both flame and ember, and his apprentice, a shadow, a weapon, a throne without voice. But the fire is never silent for long. He trained Darth Maul as a dagger, raised in darkness, forged in cruelty. Maul knew only hatred. He was not a student, he was a blade. But Sidious knew Maul would never replace him. He was useful, but incomplete, disposable, a decoy for the Jedi's gaze. Then came Count Dooku, Jedi Master turned heretic, seduced by the rot in the Republic. Sidious named him Darth Tyrannus, a Sith of nobility, of calculation. But again, Sidious lied. Dooku was a placeholder, a bridge, a pawn in a larger ritual. For Sidious did not seek a servant. He sought a vessel, one worthy of holding the true future of the Sith, the final fire. And in the desert he found it. Anakin Skywalker, a slave child, a prodigy of the Force, born of no father, conceived in shadow, in myth, a boy spoken of in Jedi prophecy, the chosen one destined to bring balance. But what is balance? To the Sith, not harmony, not peace, extinction. To the Sith, balance is silence. It is the death of the Jedi, the end of light. Sidious watched, waited. Let the boy rise within the Jedi Order. He planted seeds, gently, patiently, a compliment here, a whisper there. The Jedi, arrogant and blind, mistrusted their own prophecy. They feared Anakin's power, yet needed his skill. They taught him control, but never understanding. They chained him with rules, but fed his hunger with war. In time, the fire grew in him, anger at injustice, rage at helplessness, fear of loss. Sidious knew the wound was ready. But first the fire must spread. He unleashed war upon the galaxy. The Clone Wars, born of his will. As Chancellor of the Republic, he led the light. As Darth Sidious, he led the dark. Two armies, one master. The Jedi were forced into generalship. Honor became strategy. Peace became bloodshed. And Anakin Skywalker, hero of the Republic, was forged in the fire of war. He killed, he led, he obeyed, but within, the fire whispered, "Why do they fear you? Why do they hide truths from you? Why must she die, Pandem?" The only light in his crumbling world and in his dreams, she died again and again, choked by the future, swallowed by fate. He begged the Jedi for help. They offered nothing but platitudes, no attachments, no passion, no love, and in the silence, Sidious whispered, "There is a way. The Jedi will not teach you, but I will." The fire consumed the master, not in combat, but in surrender. Anakin chose Sidious, not in hatred, in desperation. He believed love could be preserved through control, that death could be undone, that power could stop fate. He pledged himself, and a new name was spoken, carved into the galaxy with a scream. Darth Vader, the apprentice, was now fire, and yet Sidious smiled, for he believed he had one. He had survived. not by facing the fire, but by directing it. Vader became his enforcer, his blade. The Jedi Temple burned. Younglings fell in silence. Mace Windu fell from the sky. The Republic died with a cheer. The Empire rose, but the rule had shifted. In every generation before, the apprentice killed the master. That was the ritual, was the law, but Sidious remained. Vader served, and in that violation, something twisted. The fire does not burn forever in submission. It flickers, it smolders, it waits. Sidious believed himself immune, but the rule of two is not just a tradition. It is the will of the dark side itself. To violate it is to invite imbalance, and imbalance brings death. Vader would not remain. Servant, not forever. The fire would consume again. Chapter 5. The phantoms seed in, the shadows beneath the throne. Something ancient stirred. Not a scream, not a whisper, but a pulse. A presence, the echo of a mind that once reached beyond time. For the rule of two was never truly Bane's alone. It was a branch, not a root. A shadow cast by an even darker shadow. And in the hollow places of the Sith, it is said there was always another, a phantom behind the phantom, a secret behind the lie, the seed from which all darkness flowered. The Sith Eternal called him Master. The galaxy forgot his name, but the Sith ... remembered. Darth Plagueis, the Wise. That was the name they dared speak, but never too loud. Never when the Holocaust listened, for his knowledge was not of war or flame, but of the very breath of life. He walked among the living and the dead. He did not seek to conquer the Republic. He sought to escape death itself, to grasp the midichlorians and bend them to his will, to cheat the Force, and with it the cycle. No master, no apprentice, no end. Only him, forever. He believed the rule of two was a chain, and he would break it, but he needed a vessel, a mind sharp enough to learn, a soul cold enough to discard love, mercy, fear. And so he found a boy on Naboo, a politician, a phantom smile with a blackened heart. Sheev, Palpatine, Sidious, the perfect mask. And into him, Plagueis poured his wisdom, his obsession, his secrets, the power to manipulate life, to prevent death. But the rule was watching. The fire was listening, and when Plagueis closed his eyes in triumph, he never opened them again. Sidious struck, not in battle, but in silence, while Plagueis slept. No duel, no honor, just betrayal. It was the rule's design, and yet Sidious retained his master's obsession, immortality, not to save life, but to hoard power, to reign not for decades, but centuries, not just as emperor, but as a god. And so he began planting seeds of his own. One such seed took root on Exegol, the hidden world of the Sith Eternal, a graveyard, a womb, a cult untouched by time, preserving the essence of the Sith in ritual, sacrifice, and science. There Sidious seeded experiments, cloned bodies, dark side conduits, artificial vessels, not apprentices, not successors, shells, for when his flesh failed, he would not fall. He would transfer, possess, survive, 1,000 ships, 1,000 minds, one soul. Another seed was born, not of science, ... but of blood. The Whispers say he used the Force to create a child. Others claim he cloned himself, imperfectly. What matters is this: a strand of Sidious was carried forward, and that strand bore a daughter, and that daughter bore a child, and in secret in hiding, that child grew, not in darkness, but in light, far from the Sith, far from the Empire. Her name was Rey, and she would one day choose the name Skywalker, but that moment lies in the far future. For now, the rule of two had shifted again. Vader was apprentice in name, servant in truth. Sidious grew stronger, older, colder. He constructed the Death Star, not merely as a weapon of war, but as a weapon of fear, a symbol of his eternal dominion. And Vader, obeyed. Yet the fire still burned. The rule was broken, yes, but the Force does not forget. In the eyes of the old code, there were now three Sith, the Master, the Apprentice, and the Phantom that would replace them both. The balance frayed. The prophecies stirred, and into this moment came the boy from Tatooine, Luke, son of Vader, son of Anakin, the child of fire and loss, hidden from the Emperor, raised in sand, dreaming of stars. The Jedi had been broken, their temple turned to ash, but in Luke the light endured. Obi-Wan watched, Yoda whispered, and the Force, awakened. Sidious saw the threat too late. He had planned for war, betrayal, treason, but he had not planned for hope. Not like this, and the rule of two, which had kept the Sith alive for 1,000 years, began to unravel. Because Vader, the weapon, the enforcer, the chosen flame, saw in Luke not a threat, but a reflection, a mirror of what he had been, what he could have been. And within him, the fire did not die. It changed, it flickered, softer. And in that moment, Anakin stirred beneath the mask. The Master felt it, feared it, and so Sidious demanded the boys. Death, but Vader hesitated. The fire had returned, not as destruction, but as choice, and for the first time in 1,000 years. The apprentice looked upon the Master not as servant, not as heir, but as father. And in that moment the rule of two collapsed, not in battle, but in redemption. Yet the Phantom still stirs. The seeds still lie buried. For Sidious would not die easily. His spirit, like his plan, was eternal, and in time it would rise again. Chapter 6. The tomb beneath Exegol Beneth, the ashes of forgotten stars. Deeper than any map would dare reveal, there lies a tomb that is not a tomb, a cradle wrapped in death, where thunder never ceases and the sky weeps. Black snow, Exegol, the last breath of the Sith, a planet erased from star charts, swallowed in legend, hidden by design. It was not the seat of the Sith Empire. It was older than empire. It was older than war. It was the wound that bled the rule of two into being. And it was here, far from light, that the final plan was carved in stone and bone. The Sith Eternal built their sanctum in silence. No Senate, no clone army, no Senate votes, no public executions. This was not conquest. This was preservation. Thousands of acolytes, born in darkness, sworn not to a creed, but to a man who had already died. Sidious, he who fell, he who returned, he who could not perish so long as hate remembered him. His body died upon the Death Star, but death, to the Sith, is not exile, it is migration. The essence of Darth Sidious, ripped from his dying shell, screamed into the void and was caught, bound, preserved by alchemy and ritual. His soul clung to imperfect vessels, cloned flesh, broken forms, bodies that decayed as fast as they lived. The dark side could keep his mind alive, but not whole, not stable, not forever. And so the cult worked, night after night, life after life. Countless failures, grown in vats and whispered over with ancient chants, all seeking the perfect shell. One clone came close. It was not strong in the force, a defect by Sidious standard, but it lived, it lasted, and it bore a daughter. That daughter bore a child, and in her bloodline, unknowingly, flowed the last spark of Darth Sidious. The child was named Rey, yet she was hidden from him, spirited away by parents, who had glimpsed what their daughter was to become. Sidious hunted them across the stars, desperate to reclaim the vessel of his rebirth. They died screaming, but the girl lived. She grew up in loneliness, scavenging scraps on Jakku, dreaming of parents who would never return. All while, across the galaxy, the Emperor waited in shadows deeper than death. For decades, his voice returned only in whispers, prophecies, holocrons, echoes of a voice long thought silenced. His empire had fallen. The Death Stars had shattered. The rebellion had risen. But in the black vaults beneath Exegol, he watched. He waited. He rebuilt, and when the time was right, he moved. The final order was not a military fleet. It was a resurrection. Thousands of star destroyers, each a world killer, each forged in secrecy, baptized in storm. They did not rise from dry docks. They were born from death, birthed by cultists and machines, grown in endless rows beneath the cursed sky. Each vessel bore the mark of the Sith, not as soldiers, but as instruments, extensions of one will, one voice, one master, the galaxy. Meanwhile, believed the Sith had been vanquished, that Anakin's sacrifice had broken the chain, that balance had returned. But beneath the surface, the rule had evolved. There was no apprentice, there was no throne room, there was only Sidious and the will to endure. He wore no crown. He wore a tattered cloak, hunched and broken, his hands rotted to bone, his eyes two suns in an eternal storm. He could not walk unaided. Machines held him upright, tubes fed him blood. But his voice remained absolute, and across the galaxy, loyalists heard it. Snoke was not his rival. He was his puppet, a vessel with no soul, a mouth through which Sidious spoke, a test, not a successor. And when Kylo Ren, heir to Vader's pain, destroyed Snoke, the mask fell. The voice revealed its source. Sidious was not gone. He had simply changed. But the rule of two, the sacred law, still whispered its old hunger. Only two, and so, as always, Sidious sought to shape a final dyad. Not a master and a servant, but a fusion. A union of darkness so pure it would render the rule of two obsolete. And in Rey and Ben Solo, he saw the potential for that bond. A dyad in the Force, a wound and a healer, a mirror and its shadow. If they could be united, if their essence could be harvested, Sidious would rise again, not as a corpse, not as a clone, but as a god among stars. And yet the flaw returned. The eternal flaw. Rey chose the light. She walked into the tomb, not to kneel, but to end the chain. And Ben, the broken boy who had once called himself Kylo, turned back, not to power, to family, to love. And in their defiance, the rule of two ended for the final time. Not by blade, by compassion. Sidious unleashed all the hate in his withered body. Lightning, rage, fury. He tried to consume their bond. But their unity did not serve him. It destroyed him. His own power turned upon him, reflected by the girl he had crafted to be his heir. And in a single scream, centuries of pain turned to dust. Exegol shook. The tomb cracked. The cult burned. The fleet fell, and in silence, the Sith died. But some whispers say he never truly left, that where one phantom fades, another waits to rise, that the rule of two is not a law, but a curse, and curses always return. Chapter 7. Shadows that Speak. My name the Force does not forget. It dreams, and in its deepest dreams, voices echo that should have long since faded. Even after the tomb of Exegol cracked, even after the lightning of Sidious collapsed in on itself like a star devouring its light, the curse of the rule of two did not die. It could not, for it was never merely a code or a tradition. It was a whisper, a wound, a binding made not by hands, but by hatred itself. And hate does not die. It remembers. Those who followed the rule of two did not merely pass knowledge. They wove themselves into the flesh of the Force, with every betrayal, with every murder of a master by an apprentice. Their names were etched deeper into the current. Bane, Zana, Cognos, Tenebrous, Plagueis, Sidious, the chain of Sith Lords, stretching back over 1,000 years, each one falling to make the next stronger. But when the last breath of Sidious burned away, that ancient chain did not scatter. It coiled inward. It fed upon itself. The spirits of the old ones did not flee. They watched. In the stillness after Exegol, the galaxy believed itself free. Peace returned like a breath held too long. Statues toppled, cults vanished, fleets crumbled. But the rule of two had never lived in fleets. It lived in voices, in shadows, in dreams, and slowly, across forgotten worlds, those shadows began to stir. Whispers crept into the minds of Force sensitives who had never known the Sith in their sleep. They saw temples submerged in blood. They heard a voice they could not name, but all remembered. A voice like broken glass. It did not call itself Sidious. It did not need to. It knew them. It understood them. It said, "You have been chosen. You are not alone." The Jedi, broken and scattered, could feel something was wrong. But the Guardians of Light had grown weary of war. Their order was too thin. Their books too old. And so they named it imbalance, turbulence, echoes of pain. But they did not name it what it was. It was the rule of two, reborn not in blood, but in voice, a voice that no longer needed a body, a voice that fed on doubt, on anger, on silence, a voice that remembered you, and among the ruins of the galaxy, something answered back. There were those who never believed the Sith had perished. Scholars in the Outer Rim, former cultists, children of Imperial officers raised on ghost stories of Palpatine's last command. They gathered in secret, not to build fleets, not to crown a master, but to listen. They did not call themselves Sith. They had no Darth names, but they obeyed. And when the voice whispered, "There must always be two," they knew what was required. A child was taken from a broken world. Another was trained in exile. And somewhere in the dark, a new wound began to bleed. But these new Sith were not as the old. They did not wear armor or wield sabers shaped by tradition. They were ghosts wearing skin, prophets without names. They built nothing, they unmade. Planets began to lose their moons. Convoys vanished in routes untouched by war. Star systems flickered out of communication. There was no war. There were no battles. Just a slow, sacred forgetting. And in the quiet, the voice grew louder. There is no death. There is only the next. The Force, too, began to twist. Not just light, not just dark, but a third current, invisible, unclaimed, a scar across the fabric of time. It bled into the visions of young Jedi. They spoke of a great eye watching them, of voices calling from behind walls of light, of choices made before they were born, and always, always a shadow that knew their names before they spoke them. Some fell to madness, others fell to silence, and in one dark temple, untouched since the fall of the High Republic, a message etched into stone flared to life for the first time in centuries. I am all the Sith. It was not prophecy, it was memory, carved by preserved by those who had worshipped him in silence. And beneath the temple, a vault, one that had never been opened, began to breathe, not with air, with presence. Something waited. The rule of two was not dead. It had merely shed its skin. It no longer needed a master and an apprentice. It needed only one voice and one answer, and both were being born again. The Jedi would not see it until it was too late, and the galaxy would not understand until the stars themselves began to go out. Chapter 8. The hands that tear the veil. They came not with banners, but with memory, not with names, but with scars. Across the galaxy, the veil thinned, and what was hidden beneath it began to press against the living world. For millennia, the rule of two had been a secret flame, passed in darkness from one vessel to another. Now it was no longer content to be hidden. The flame wanted to burn. In ancient places, places where Jedi temples had turned to dust, where Sith altars had cracked and bled, there were stirrings, not armies, ruptures. The Force did not flow cleanly anymore. It warped around those who carried the voice of the old masters. They were nameless, but they were marked. Some were children, some were outcasts, some had never known what the Sith were. But the voice had called them, and when they answered, they changed. Their eyes burned gold and violet. Their touch withered. The earth, the air around them hummed with pain. But they did not scream. They only listened. And when they moved, entire cities fell silent. Not destroyed, unwritten, the Jedi, now few and scattered like broken bones across a dying creature, could not agree on what they were facing. Some said it was Sidious reborn. Others said the Force itself was unraveling, purging the galaxy of its own mistakes. But those who were oldest, those who had lived through the Clone Wars, through the fall of the Republic, through the madness of the Emperor, they knew, they remembered what Yoda had once whispered, in a voice cracked by fear, the shadow, that falls is not always cast by one being. Now the shadows were legion. Across forgotten hyperspace lanes, a temple rose from black sand. It had no name. It was not built. It was called. Its pillars twisted like smoke, turned to bone. Its gates were carved in languages no living creature had ever spoken. And within it, two beings stood in silence. They had never met. They had never spoken. But the rule of two burned within them both, not in words, not in codes, but in hunger. One was young, carved from loss and fury. The other was ancient, wrapped in silence, eyes blind from seeing too much. They were not master and apprentice. They were not Sith, but something older than Bane whispered. Between them, only through conflict, can power be made true. And in that moment, without plan or consent, the rule of two was reborn. Not in loyalty, but in inevitability. They raised no armies. They claimed no thrones. They were the veil being torn open by Force itself. And as the veil tore, others began to hear. The Kaiser's ascendancy recorded unexplained Force tremors beyond their borders. visions of ancient pyramids and crimson storms. In the deep core, explorers vanished near forgotten worlds once touched by the Sith on Dathomir. The Night Sisters heard the ground sing with voices not their own, and from the unknown regions a scream echoed outward, a soundless cry that made even beasts howl and flee the night. The Force was not at balance. It was awakening to a truth it had buried. Too long there would always be two, not by design, but by consequence. Light calls to dark. Master calls to apprentice. Power begets desire, and when desire cannot be contained, it spills, and spill it did, across the stars. Jedi began to dream of red suns and broken masks. They awoke in cold sweats, whispering names they did not know. Bane, Nihilus, Sidious, acolytes of the old voice began appearing in places thought lost, not as conquerors, but as warnings. They said nothing. They walked into towns and cities, and temples, and looked into the eyes of the faithful, and then they vanished, leaving only madness behind. The veil had been torn. The hands that did it had no names, no teachings, no goal but truth. And the truth was this: the rule of two was not a chain to be broken. It was a wound in the galaxy, and now it had begun to bleed. The Force, in all its vastness, could no longer contain the darkness that had once been given shape in Sidious. That shape had shattered, but its essence, its curse, now moved freely, without body, without boundary. No longer Sith, no longer Jedi, only will, only hunger, only the voice. And the voice had found its echo. It was no longer a whisper, it was a scream, and it was coming for all who had forgotten. Chapter 9. The echoes beyond flesh. The old truths decayed, but the old wounds never closed. Though the Jedi clung to their illusions of peace, and the Sith once believed they could control the shape of fate, neither understood what had been loosed into the stars. The rule of two had never been a philosophy. It was a curse, a design etched in pain. And now that design moved beyond bodies, beyond names, beyond the need for flesh. What once required a master and an apprentice, what once bound the darkness to form, no longer obeyed such limits. The rule had evolved. It no longer waited for new blood. It passed instead into presence, into the bones of forgotten worlds, into cursed artifacts, into minds that had never known the dark side yet dreamed of it each night. The rule of two had become something metaphysical, a hunger that leaped between stars without voice, without form, but never without purpose. In the ruins of Malachor, where sabers once burned through ash and time, a wanderer fell to her knees. Overcome by visions, she had never known a master. She had never held a blade. But when she screamed, the walls responded, not with sound, but with memory. She saw twin figures moving through darkness, never touching, yet always circling. One reaching, one retreating, one desiring to learn, one waiting to be destroyed. She wept, not from fear, but from recognition, for she, too, had become part of the pattern. In the unknown regions, fleets died in silence, not by weapons, but by thought. Entire command crews frozen in place, minds shattered not by any visible force, but by the realization that their actions had already been seen, already been punished. The darkness that touched them had no form. It came in the breath between words, in the moment before sleep, and it whispered a prophecy too old for any holocron. All power returns to two, and from two only one shall survive. The voice now spoke through dreams, through wounds, through echoes in metal. It touched dying Jedi and showed them their future selves, twisted and radiant with fury. It infected Sith spirits long imprisoned in obsidian vaults, awakening them to a galaxy that had moved on, but one which could still be dragged back. Even droids, once deaf to the Force, began to flicker strangely when passing through ancient war zones. Recordings distorted, sensors failed, and some whispered, after long silence, names that had not been uttered in 10,000 years. The rule of two had passed into myth, but myth had teeth on Jeddah. Monks, once devoted to balance, tore their sacred texts apart, screaming that balance was a lie, that all history was but the dance of two shadows, endlessly consuming, endlessly rebirthing. In the halls of the fallen Jedi temple on Coruscant, a secret chamber cracked open for the first time in centuries. It was not opened by hand, it opened by will, and inside, nothing remained but ash, no relics, no bones. Just the burned impression of two figures carved into the floor, one kneeling, one standing, both consumed by flame. The galaxy did not yet see this awakening, but it felt it. The Force grew heavier. The stars pulsed with irregular light. Hyperdrives failed at random. Time itself slipped in subtle ways, battles repeating, conversations doubling, as if the past was folding in on the present. And always, at the edges of perception, there were two presences, watching, wanting, waiting. They were not Sith, they were not Jedi. They were what came after, in hidden corners of the outer rim. Those sensitive to the Force began carving strange symbols into the earth. Circles within circles, spirals folding into points, eyes that bled. These were not cults, they were vessels. The Force moved through them like wind through hollow reeds, carrying the old scream. The scream of Bane, of Revan, of Plagueis, of Sidious forward toward rebirth, because the rule of two had never been about control. It was about transcendence, about compression, about pressure so great it could break reality itself. One to embody power, one to crave it, one to burn, one to consume. And when flesh was no longer enough, the rule passed into essence, into code, into story, into the very memory of the Force. It became a wound that could not be healed, only endured. And as this realization took root across space and species, one final horror became clear. The rule of two was not something invented, it was something remembered, something buried in the very nature of the Force, waiting to be triggered, waiting to be reborn. And now, as stars dimmed and war drums began to beat in rhythms not heard since the founding of the first Sith Order, that rebirth had begun, not in flesh, but in echo dot, in the breath of worlds, in the silence after death, in the whisper before birth, and the echo grew louder. Chapter 10. The Throne that devours the Master. There is no seat of power that does not hunger for the one who sits upon it. The rule of two was born of war, refined by blood, and perfected by betrayal, but its final lesson was never spoken, only suffered, that the throne itself is the true Sith, and every master who claims it is already dying. For power, true power, does not serve, it consumes. It lures the apprentice not only to challenge the master, but to replace the very will of the rule itself. And when they rise, they believe themselves to be the culmination. But the truth lies deeper. They are only another voice added to the throne's echo, just another shadow bound to the greater shadow, sacrificed not to freedom, but to the illusion of control. The first to understand this was Bane, but he did not speak it. He encoded it, buried it within the holocrons, trapped it in language that only the desperate could decipher. For even he feared the truth, that the throne of the Sith was not a creation of the dark side, but its host, a fixed point, a singular wound in the fabric of the Force where all Sith converge. All masters fall, and all apprentices forget themselves. Sidious thought he was the rule's endpoint. He thought he was the throne. But he too was mistaken, for the throne devoured him. It devoured Plagueis, whose mind reached through the currents of the midi-chlorians to touch immortality only to find silence. It devoured Tenebrous, whose calculations could not predict the rot he passed to his own apprentice. It devoured Cognos, Millennial, Zana. All of them reached for power and found only hunger. It is not the dark side that lies. It is the desire to master it that blinds. The throne waits for no one. It chooses no one. It merely absorbs, quietly, endlessly. And now the throne grows full, in the shadows of Exegol, in vaults built on cursed foundations. The throne stirs not as a seat of command, but as a living wound, pulsing with every betrayal, every scream, every sacrifice made in the name of power. The Sith Eternal, thinking themselves loyal, kneel before its corpse shell, building fleets, conjuring echoes, whispering to shadows. But they do not know what they serve, for the throne remembers. It remembers Bane's agony as Zana shattered his mind from within. It remembers Revan, torn between two halves of himself, never able to sit, only to wander. It remembers Sidious, whose mastery of death only prolonged his torment. The throne sees no victory in these names. It sees fuel, and it waits, always, for the next apprentice to believe they are different. But the throne already knows them. In secret, it guides their fears. It feeds them visions. It poisons their love, their ambition, their hopes. It leads them to murder, not only their masters, but themselves piece by piece, until they are only function, only instrument, only shadow. And then the throne opens, not to seat them, but to swallow them, for the rule of two is not a lineage, it is a furnace, and the Sith are its firewood. Even the strongest fall, even the wisest burn. Yoda, who glimpsed the truth, warned not of the Sith, but of what makes them. He knew the rule was not sustainable, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. It bred a perfection of evil so intense, so efficient, that it required collapse. That was its nature. The apprentice must kill the master, but the throne kills them both. And now, at the end of all things, the echoes grow louder. The throne is calling again. Acolytes wander through dead space, seeking fragments. Dark side nexuses flare to life, unbidden. Artifacts long buried scream into hyperspace. Something beneath the surface of the Force is awakening, not a person, not a Sith, but a pattern, a recurrence, a devouring cycle, one to embody power, one to crave it, both to fall and the throne. Ancient and unseen cracks with laughter made of silence. It does not need flesh. It does not need names. It waits only for belief. Because once the apprentice believes they are the master, once they accept the rule and bend it to their will, once they speak, "I am the Sith," they are already gone. Their bones may remain, their legacy may echo, but their soul belongs to the throne, and the throne does not. Forget Chapter 11, the shadow that devours the past in the bowels of time where memory curdles and prophecy bleeds. there coils a shadow with no name. It is not a Sith. It is not a Jedi. It is not bound to the flesh of any one master or apprentice, but drifts like a wound in the force of parasite, older than the rule, deeper than Bane, and darker than Sidious. It is the shadow that feeds on the past, and in return devours the future. Every generation feels it, but none recognize its shape. It has no temple, no throne, no voice, and yet its will is absolute. This is the shadow behind the rule of two. It was born not in war, but in regret. A whisper born at the moment when pride turns to loss, when ambition withers into fear. Each Sith who perished before their vision could bloom added a thread to its veil. Khan's Ismur, Darth Nihilus, Exar Kun, Darth Trier, all of them fell, but their deaths did not end them. Their memories fermented. Their spirits, stretched thin by hatred and shame, began to thread together into something new. Something that could not die because it never truly lived. A shadow of memory, a ghost of pain, and with each fallen Sith, it grew darker. It is not a phantom in the night. Is the night. It is the accumulated weight of every failure, every slaughtered apprentice, every murdered master, and it hates. Not like the Sith hate, not personally, not loudly, but like a cold void that resents the light itself. And so it whispers, not to the Jedi, not to the weak. It whispers only to the ones strong enough to destroy themselves. It whispered to Bane before he was ready. It whispered to Zana as she clenched her master's bones. It whispered to Tenebris as he drowned in foresight. It whispered to Sidious in the firelight of Plagueis' death, and it whispered to Vader every time he dreamed of Mustafar. And each time it was mistaken for conscience, for memory, for guilt. But it was none of these. It was history made flesh through pain. The Jedi thought they destroyed Sith knowledge, raising temples, erasing names, but the shadow hides in fragments. One holocron here, one Sith dagger there, a ruin beneath Malachor, a chant murmured by cults on forgotten moons. These are its roots, not preserved by intention, but by trauma. The rule of two allowed this shadow to feed freely, undisturbed, through an unbroken line of master and apprentice who carried not just knowledge, but scars. And like all parasites, it grew clever. It began to reshape visions. It began to insert doubt. It taught the Sith not just to desire power, but to obsess over it. It is not enough, it whispered, to rule. You must become the rule. You must erase your master's memory, then raise your own name above the stars. But in doing so, they fed the shadow even more. For what is more nourishing than ego crushed beneath the weight of its own expectation? This is why the Sith never last. This is why every dynasty ends in betrayal. This is why the rule of two is not evolution, but regression disguised as clarity. The Sith believed they were the darkness, but the darkness had moved on. The darkness had evolved beyond form, beyond title, beyond need. It was no longer Sith. It was the idea that nothing matters but victory, and that all victory ends in silence. The shadow does not fight, it waits. It lets the Sith burn themselves, then takes what remains. Every death, every scream, every failed prophecy is a candle snuffed in its name. Even Sidious, for all his mastery, was blind to it. He thought the voices in the dark came from his past, from Plagueis, from his own madness. He never saw the deeper truth that he had become only a shell, a carrier of the shadow's will. Every clone, every resurrection, every vision of eternal empire These were not his ideas, they were echoes. The shadow does not care if they succeed, it only cares that they suffer. It only cares that they remember, because remembrance is fuel. The more they fear the past, the more the shadow grows. The more they cling to identity, the more their identity slips from them, until one day there is nothing left, no name, no face, only the rule, only the pain, only the echo. And then it is passed on to the next child of fire who thinks they are different. But the shadow already knows them. It knew Bane, it knew Revan, it knew Sidious, it even knew Anakin Skywalker long before he burned, and now it knows you, listener. Of these words, you who dream of power, you who wonder what it would feel like to command the Force without restraint. The shadow sees your hunger, it sees your doubt, and it waits patiently, because it is not a master. It does not kill you. It simply lets you walk the path until your feet vanish behind you and your name becomes another whisper in the dark. And the rule of two marches on, not as a law, but as a curse. Chapter 12. The bones beneath the throne, the rule of two, they believed, would bring dominion everlasting, a line unbroken, a throne never empty. But beneath every throne is a grave, and beneath every Sith master who dared to rise, there lay the crushed bones of those who came before, mourned, unremembered, and unredeemed. This was the great deception, whispered softly through the ages, that to sit upon the black throne was to conquer death itself. But death was always the throne's truest occupant, and it laughed in silence. In the tomb worlds of Moraband and the blackened vaults of Malachor, the ancient dead were not laid to rest. They were buried alive in memory, fossilized in vengeance. Some called them spirits, some illusions, others echoes in the Force. But the truth was simpler. They were mistakes that refused to be forgotten. And each new Dark Lord believed they could learn from those mistakes without becoming them. But they all did, one by one, in secret and in pride. Bane's bones were not beneath his apprentice's feet. They were inside her. His thoughts, his fears, his final doubts, passed through blood and blade, sealed with lightning and the stench of betrayal. Zana carried him even as she claimed to destroy him. Her laughter rang hollow for decades, but her nights were never quiet, for even victory was haunted. The apprentice never escapes the master. They only wear their skin more tightly. Tenebris, the cold seer of futures, saw the galaxy like a crystal prism. His calculations were perfect. His body was perfect. His death was not. Buried alive, in the mind of his apprentice, he lingered like rot in the marrow of Plagueis, not as a ghost, but as a lesson unlearned. And when Plagueis fell, strangled in the stillness of a moonless night, he too left behind no corpse, only a whisper coiled behind Sidious' eyes, reminding him that he too would fall. And fall he did. Oh, but Sidious, the throne was never so cruel as when it welcomed him, for he believed he had made it, crafted it, designed its every edge with the bones of others. He was not a successor, he was the end, and in that belief he summoned the dead to kneel before him. Holocrons, rituals, forbidden arts. He mastered their secrets and remade himself in their image, a patchwork, gods sewn together from the sins of every age. Yet he too became bones. The rule had no loyalty, no love. It fed only on fear and legacy. Sidious was brilliant, yes, but his brilliance was not his own. It was stolen, gleaned from the grave songs of Darths long dead. He stood upon their shoulders, blind to the fact that their hands were reaching up, not to raise him, but to drag him down. For there is no triumph in Sith succession, only a deeper grave each time. An Anakin Skywalker. He was not meant to sit upon the throne, he was meant to end it. The chosen one, forged by prophecy, shaped by war, broken by love. Sidious thought he could mold him. The shadow thought it could possess him. But Anakin was neither servant nor sovereign. He was fire, given form, the only one who refused to inherit the bones, the only one who burned the throne itself. Yet he, too, died a slave, because the rule does not allow freedom, not even to those who defy it. It takes many shapes, sometimes a crown, sometimes a mask, sometimes a crimson blade ignited in the dark. But its essence is always the same: legacy devouring identity. It is not enough to kill the master. One must become them, and in doing so, the chain is reforged, the throne is rebuilt, and the bones beneath it multiply. So what, then, is the true cost of power? It is inheritance without choice, to know you are not the first, to feel the cold beneath your feet and realize it is not stone, it is skulls. To speak your own name in triumph, only to hear 100 voices echoing it back in mockery, each one a fallen tyrant who once believed they had finally won. This is the Sith's greatest failure. They sought immortality, but found only repetition. They sought freedom, but chained themselves to history. They sought dominion, but all they ever ruled were tombs. And so the rule of two continues, not as a path to power, but as a cycle of ruin. Every apprentice thinks they are breaking it. Every master thinks they have perfected it, but none ever leave it. They only descend deeper, closer to the bones, closer to the original wound, closer to the first sin. The throne waits it always. Does. And as the next apprentice raises their blade, ready to strike down their master and claim their place, they do not hear the laughter beneath them. They do not feel the grip of ancient fingers tightening round their ankles. They do not see the throne's true shape, but it sees them, and it is hungry. Chapter 13. The Serpent, who devoured its master. Every serpent begins as a whisper in the dust, winding through shadow with eyes fixed on the flame above. But not all serpents seek warmth. Some were born from darkness and crawl only toward the cold. In the age of Sith remembrance, one such serpent shed its skin in silence. It did not roar or boast or scream as it grew. It listened, it waited, and when its moment came, it did not strike with rage, swallowed the master whole, and digested him in darkness. This was the apprentice known only to the ancients as the devourer, the one who knew the rule of two was not a rule at all, but a doorway into eternity. Before Darth Sidious, before the wars, before the Chosen One's fall, there lived Darth Plagueis, the wise. But wisdom, as the Sith often learn, is a double-edged saber. He had studied death itself, not as an enemy, but as a prisoner he might one day set free. To him, immortality was not myth. It was method, science, the alchemy of flesh and will. He poured his life into the manipulation of midichlorians, bending nature's breath into a whisper that could not die. And in this ambition, he did not seek to conquer the galaxy. He sought to escape it. His apprentice, however, saw no such mercy. For in the shadow of that unnatural science was born the darkest serpent the Sith ever bred. Darth Sidious, child of Naboo, father of empires and murderer of gods. He watched his master build the keys to eternity, and stole them before the door could open. He needed no ritual, no lightning, no army, only silence. In the stillness of a sleep chamber, one breath was held too long, one heartbeat was stolen. And Plagueis, for all his knowledge, did not foresee that his greatest creation was not immortality, but betrayal. Sidious devoured his master not out of hunger, but because that was the way. The old Sith would speak of glory, of pain, of trial. Sidious whispered only of results. He did not hate his master. He respected him, and in that cold respect, he did what all great serpents do. He ensured there would be no corpse, no memory, no shrine. Plagueis was erased from the living force, cut loose from legacy, reduced to a myth even among his own kind, and in that act, Sidious revealed the truth of the rule of two. It was never about power shared, it was about devouring. Each apprentice a fang, each master a meal. The strong do not survive, the strong are consumed. Only the cunning remain, and Sidious was cunning beyond any Sith who had ever drawn breath. He did not rule from the shadows alone. He became the shadow, wove himself into the fabric of the Republic, masked as a servant, until the entire galaxy bent to his will. He did not lift a saber to take power, he let others lift theirs for him. Wars ignited not by soldiers, but by ideas. And when the Jedi fell, they did not fall to a blade. They fell to a plan. But even the serpent cannot shed every skin. Sidious believed he had ended the cycle, that the rule of two would die with him, perfected at last. But the rule of two does not die. It only waits. For even as he declared himself emperor, he took a new apprentice, not one of Sith blood, not one forged in the old ways, but a boy broken, burning, bound in prophecy. Darth Vader was not his successor. He was his undoing, for Sidious had forgotten the first law of devouring. That which you consume may consume you. Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, was never meant to be ruled. He was meant to end all ruling. And though Sidious believed he had swallowed the boy whole, the boy was not truly dead. He lingered, he burned beneath the mask. He waited, and in time, he rose. In the end, Sidious too was consumed, not by Vader's strength, not by rebellion, but by love, a thing no Sith can ever comprehend. The serpent devoured his master, yes, but he could never digest the light. That was the flaw. That was always the flaw. For the rule of two breeds monsters who eat monsters, but it cannot understand what is not monstrous, and so it fails, again and again. Every apprentice who devours their master becomes them. Every master who raises a child in fire forgets that fire consumes all things, even thrones, even gods. So now you ask, was Sidious the last? No, because even he, in secret, forged another, clones, vessels, echoes of himself cast into the void. Not apprentices, reflections, for in the end he could not trust another to devour. Him he could not trust the rule, he could not trust the serpent. So he became the serpent, forever eating its own tail, lost in the dream of dominion unending. But there is no end, only repetition, and the bones beneath the throne grow louder. Chapter 14. A Throne. Without shadow, there came a moment when the serpent had no prey left to swallow, no Jedi left to murder, no Senate left to corrupt, no war left to orchestrate. The galaxy lay beneath his feet, cold and quiet, and the stars themselves seemed to whisper his name. That ye see, Jules, Emperor of all, the architect of the Sith's final hour, the wielder of power so vast, it could no longer be measured by fleets or fire, but by the absence of resistance. The throne he built was not forged of metal or stone. It was made of fear, and fear does not cast a shadow, it becomes it. But there was no joy in his empire, no satisfaction, for the Sith do not crave peace. They do not hunger for stillness. They hunger only for the next scream, the next betrayal, the next step up the corpse ladder to eternity. And Sidious had climbed so high, so utterly alone, that the air itself froze in his lungs. His throne stood in a void of his own making, and in that void, something began to stir. The rule of two had always been a cycle of death, rebirth, and devouring. But now, there was no apprentice strong enough to strike him down, no master above to whisper ancient truths. Darth Vader was broken, shackled not by the dark side, but by regret, a half-man, half-machine, spectre of what could have been. And in that fracture, Sidious saw the death of the rule, not with thunder, but with silence. He had won, and by winning, he had lost everything. For what is a throne with no shadow? What is dominion without defiance? Even the darkest soul is defined by the light it rejects. But Sidious had extinguished even the memory of resistance. He ruled a galaxy of submission, of cowed governors and voiceless citizens. He called it order, but it was stagnation, rot, and the dark side so wild. So ravenous does not abide rot. So he turned inward. He began to explore unnatural paths, secrets stolen from his master's corpse, clone bodies, spirit transfer, ancient rituals older than language. He studied the art of unmaking, of binding his essence beyond death. No longer content with power in this life, he wanted the next. But in doing so, he made the same error as his predecessors. He believed that legacy was control, and yet his grip was already slipping. The Force had not gone quiet, it had gone deep. Beneath the crust of the galaxy, a new tremor stirred. Girl born of no lineage, a boy cloaked in exile, ghosts of Jedi rising like ash on the wind. And in the heart of the monster he had built, Vader flicker of pain remained, a memory of her, of Pad, Mom, of Skywalker. And from that memory a seed of rebellion took root. Sidious did not fear armies, he feared hope, and hope had returned. He built a second Death Star, not as a weapon of war but as a ritual, a monument to his own permanence. A warning to the future, that even death would kneel before him. But this was not power, it was desperation in disguise. The rule of two had demanded succession, and yet he clung to life with claws bloodied by 1,000 betrayals. There was no apprentice, no future, only himself, staring into eternity, afraid to blink. And then the Skywalker came. Not Anakin Luke, the boy with his father's eyes and his mother's defiance. The boy who stepped into darkness not with anger, but with faith. Who saw the mask and reached for the man inside. Who stood before Sidious, not as a Sith, not as a Jedi but as a son. And in that moment, Sidious saw the death of all he had built. He had devoured his master, manipulated the Chosen One, broken the Jedi, enslaved the galaxy. And yet here stood a child, untrained, untested, undefeated, because the throne Sidious sat upon had no shadow, and so it casts no fear. And without fear, the illusion crumbled. Vader turned, not because he was strong, but because he remembered, and in remembering, he became Anakin Skywalker once more. He lifted the Emperor, that rotting god of shadow, and cast him into fire, and the Rule of two burned with him, but the fire did not end the cycle. It merely opened the next page. For Sidious did not die that day, not fully. His body perished, but his essence, twisted and unnatural, was already moving, slithering, reaching across stars and bloodlines. He had cheated death once. He would try again. For the throne without shadow had not crumbled. It had merely been abandoned, waiting, waiting for the next serpent, waiting for the next heir. Chapter 15, Echoes in the Flesh. That should not Beatty's scream did not end with the fall. It echoed through hyperspace, through time, through the frayed wounds of the Force itself. It was not the scream of a man, nor a Sith. It was the death cry of a defiled Ideather, rule of two, severed mid-cycle. But death, for one such as Sid, was never an end. It was a threshold, a veil to be peeled back, a puzzle to be solved. And beyond it, he waited not as a man, not even as a spirit, but as echoes, malignant and formless. Searching for flesh to corrupt, he did not return as Sidious the Chancellor, nor Sidious the Emperor. He returned as something lessened, far more terrifying. A ghost without purpose, a scream without a mouth, a will clinging to decay, crumbling clones, and rituals drawn from the ancient madness of Exegol. The final order was not a fleet. It was a necropolis of machines, bound together by Sith alchemy and blood rites. Each vessel, each weapon, each whisper in the dark was an echo of Himmer, billion fragments of a soul too stubborn to vanish. The rule of two had died, yes, but its rotted carcass had festered into something fouler. A rule of one, stretched across unholy vessels, feeding not on strength, but on imitation. His clones could not hold him. They rejected his presence, melted under the weight of his essence. They were coffins, not vessels, and he, the undying master, could do nothing but wait and scream and search. He was reborn not by will, but by failure, a Sith without a worthy heir, a god without a body, so he built one. He scoured bloodlines. He tore apart ancestry, engineering children of darkness in artificial wombs, searching for a vessel that would not shatter. Among these came one, a girl forged from his own corrupted lineage, not a daughter by love, but by design, not an apprentice by choice, but by necessity. In her he saw not a future, only a prison. She would inherit his soul, or she would die resisting it. This was not the Sith way. It was something far more desperate, far more ancient. A heresy even the Sith of old would have recoiled from, for the rule of two demanded conflict, trial, worthiness. But this was not an apprentice chosen by strength. She was bred in fear, in secrecy, a stolen future meant to carry the past, like a parasite. And the dark side recoiled, the Force twisted in rejection. Yet still he pressed forward, clinging to his final order, building fleets with world-killing weapons, hiding beneath the black storms of Exegol like a graveworm in a tomb of lightning. He did not seek to rule again. Not truly, he sought only to be born again, to devour his progeny and wear her skin like armor. He did not whisper promises to her. He commanded her through blood, but blood is not destiny, and in her a new conflict was kindled, not between Jedi and Sith, but between inheritance and identity, between what was and what could be. The Sith eternal, that cult of robed fanatics who sang praises to a corpse, did not understand. They believed themselves heirs to Bane's design, but Bane would have spat upon them, for this was not the rule of two. It was undeath, it was stagnation cloaked in thunder. The final order was not a new empire. It was a mausoleum of ships, a ghost fleet commanded by a voice that no longer remembered what life had felt like. And then the girl returned. She bore no name he truly claimed, only a reflection of her own defiance. Rey, not Sidious, not Palpatine. She stepped into the ancient Colosseum of death, stared into the face of a dying god, and chose herself. She refused the throne, refused the blood, refused the fear, and in that refusal, she became something the Rule of Two had never anticipated. Free, he opened himself. He showed her the endless sea of spirits waiting behind him. The dark side in its most ancient form, a torrent of hatred and memory, of vengeance passed down like fire through 1,000 generations of Sith. He offered her everything, power, control, eternity, but she did not kneel, and the Force, long wounded, stirred. It did not roar. It balanced, through her, around her, within her. And in her final act, she became the storm he could not possess, the echo he could not absorb. She turned his ritual against him, reflected his own hatred back upon his hollow flesh, and he, the undying shadow of the Sith, was unmade, not killed, erased. The Sith screamed in their final moment, not in anger, but in confusion, for they were not slain by warriors or betrayed by apprentices. They were denied, their cycle broken, their legacy silenced, their rule ended by a child who chose the name of her enemy and became something entirely new. And so, the Rule of Two passed from myth into memory, from prophecy into warning, its final master reduced to bone and ash, its final apprentice never born, but the Force remembers. And so do I. Chapter 16. The ashes beneath all things, beneath the shattered throne of Exegol, beneath the scorched obsidian and fallen pylons of Sith temples long forgotten, there is a silence deeper than the void between stars. It is not peace. It is not rest. It is the silence of something ancient having finally ceased to move, but not to die. For beneath all things, beneath Jedi, beneath Sith, beneath Empire and Rebellion alike, there are ashes, and within ashes there is always the memory of fire. The Rule of Two had burned bright and long and terrible. It had seared the flesh of the galaxy until the stars themselves trembled at its doctrine. But now, in the cold stillness where no apprentice rose and no master remained, the fire was gone. What lingered was smoke, residue, whispers, not of triumph, but of hunger. For the dark side does not vanish, it waits. And even as the last true Sith was dissolved into dust by the will of the Force, something beneath all things watched. For Sidious was not the first to fall, nor Bane, nor even the exiles who first defiled the Jedi Code and descended into the black oceans of Malachor. There was Sith before names, before language, before time had even learned to crawl, and it is they who remain, not in form, but in foundation. The Rule of Two was but one skeleton in the graveyard of their experiments, an echo of a greater sickness. The desire to possess the Force, to shape it, to bend it into a blade sharp enough to tear the galaxy apart. The Jedi thought the Sith destroyed, twice, thrice, but always they returned, for they were not a people, not a religion. They were a scar on the galaxy's soul, and scars cannot be healed by forgetting. The Rule of Two was a vessel, yes, but it was not the source. And now that vessel lies shattered, its final master consumed by his own reflection. Its final heir vanished into myth. But still the dark whispers, Still it pulls at the edges of will. Still it waits beneath. There are cults, still fragments, shadows, not of Bane's design, but of something far older. The acolytes of the beyond, the disciples of Rangos, the broken legions of Exegol, who wandered into the stars without masters, each clinging to ritual like a drowning soul clings to breath. They do not know what they serve, but they serve still. And in serving, they feed the memory of the rule, even if they no longer know its name. Some seek to revive it. Some claim the line of Darth is unbroken, that secret masters still plot in the smoke between systems. But it is not the same. The symmetry is lost. The sacred wound has healed into an ugly scar, and no apprentice has yet arisen worthy of the darkness that once reigned. The rule of two was not just a hierarchy, it was a covenant between destruction and rebirth. A pact signed in blood across centuries, and that pact is broken. But in the ashes, things grow, not only rot, but seeds. And this, the Force understands better than the Sith ever could. That power is not in domination, it is in balance. The rule of two failed because it refused to yield, because it devoured its own future in pursuit of eternal present. The very cycle it claimed to master became the noose by which it hung itself. The master kills the apprentice becomes the master until one day there is nothing left but a tomb. And so, in its end, the rule of two becomes its own prophecy, a warning written in the bones of dead empires, a chant murmured by hollow droids and dead-eyed zealots, always to their but not forever, not anymore, and yet, far beyond the known systems, deeper than Exegol, older than Moraband, there are ruins untouched even by time. Vaults where Sith who predated the rule sleep in stasis or whisper from crystal tombs. Some were never found. Some chose not to be. They do not honor Bane's law. They do not speak of masters or apprentices. They speak of the Force as hunger incarnate. And in the silence that follows Sidious's final breath, they listen. They stir, for the galaxy believes the Sith gone. But the Force knows better. The Force remembers, and so do I. You dream now of peace, perhaps, of a galaxy finally freed from the cycle of shadow and flame. But beneath peace lies complacency, and in complacency lies rebirth, not the Jedis nor the Siths, but something deeper, a cold renewal that does not wear robes or armor, that does not build temples or thrones. It waits beneath all things, in the ashes and at Hungers. Chapter 17. The voice that refused to die there is no silence where the Sith once spoke, only the echo of a voice that has forgotten how to fade. It clings to the tombs of 1,000 lords, drips from broken holocrons like blood from a blade, and whispers through the Force like rot beneath stone. Though the rule of two was buried in the grave it dug for itself, the voice still speaks, not from the lips of a master, not from the mind of an apprentice, but from the wound itself, the wound in the Force, the wound named Sith. It was Darth Bane who gave that voice form, he who taught it to sing in pairs, one to crave it, one to wield it, one to learn the song of pain, and the other to conduct the symphony of power. But Bane was never its creator only, its sculptor. The voice was older, older than Korriban, older than the Dark Jedi, older even than thought. It is the hunger of the Force made language, and language, once spoken, cannot be unsaid. When Bane perished, it did not scream. When Zana rose, it did not rejoice. When Plagueis bled the midichlorians and Sidious carved entire systems into altars, it did not praise. It merely watched. For the voice was not loyal. It was not theirs. It used them as they used it. And when their empires burned and their graves cracked, it endured. For the voice cannot be slain. It is not a man. It is not a will. It is the price. Jedi feared the darkness as corruption. Sith worshipped it as freedom. But neither understood it fully. The voice is not evil, nor good. It is inevitability. The Force, in its rawest form, has always balanced by fire. And fire must speak. It must call to those broken enough to hear it. Those like Revan, like Bane, like Sidious, like Anakin, they heard it, not with ears, but in the hollow behind their eyes. And once heard, it never leaves. There are those who say the dark side has no memory, that it is chaos, raw and blind, but they are wrong. It remembers every betrayal, every scream, every child turned against parents, every apprentice who stood above their dying master and felt the first sting of inheritance. It remembers the rule of two, not as law, but as testimony, proof that the voice cannot be silenced with structure. And now there are no Sith to speak for it, no temples to carry it, no flesh to twist in its name, and still it speaks. In the rustle of wind through the valley of the Dark Lords, in the static of broken holocrons, humming deep in forgotten vaults, in the veins of those who feel rage, not as emotion, but as purpose. It leaks through dreams, through bloodlines, through the Force itself, and it searches for a vessel, a shape, a listener. Some believe it found one, a scavenger girl whose fury cracked the sky, a tormented heir who killed his father and could not understand why. But they were not ready. They were not true. For to be Sith is not merely to wield power. It is to understand it, to obey it, to kneel before it not as master, but as altar. And none of them knelt. Not as Bane knelt. Not as Xana bled, or Sidious smiled, or Vader wept beneath his mask. So the voice waits, patient, patient as stone. It is not in Exegol any more. That world lies abandoned, its catacombs hollow, its machines frozen in place. The choir of Sith, spirits that once whispered there, have fallen into silence once again. Not from death, but from exhaustion. For they gave everything, and still the galaxy refused to obey. Still the Jedi flame flickers. Still love triumphs over legacy. Still hope returns. And yet the voice has not given up. It moves now in quiet. No more grand wars. No more Death Stars. It slides through cracks in the Force, binding itself to ideas, to songs, to names long thought lost. 1,000 false prophets rise across the outer rim, each claiming the mantle of Sith, of heir, of chosen. But the voice does not speak through them. It uses them, and waits for the one who will not speak, but listen. Because in the end, the rule of two was not about two beings. It was about two truths. One spoken, one hidden. The first power is meant to be passed down. The second power is meant to consume. The master teaches the apprentice to kill him, yes, but also to become him. And in that transformation, the voice continues. It is not Sidious that lives on, not Plagueis, not Tenebrous. It is the voice, and the voice is still speaking. Can you hear it? Chapter 18. The black core of all things beneath the skin of every empire. Beneath the armor of every Sith, beneath the silence of every fallen Jedi temple, there is a core dark, molten, slow. It is the place where the force becomes want, not balance, not destiny, not light, but hunger given shape. This is the black core of all things. It does not flicker, it does not burn, it waits, and when all names are gone, it remains, the final breath, the first scream, the truth beneath every lie the galaxy has ever told. It is deeper than the rule of two, older than the Jedi code. It is the buried beginning, the womb from which the Sith were born, and the grave into which they will always fall. The first dark Lord did not find it, he heard it. The last Dark Lord did not destroy it, he simply fed it. And now the black core waits again. It pulses in the broken center of every ruined world. Malachor, Korriban, Dramond, Kaz, a heartbeat too low to hear, too loud to forget. This is the place Darth Bane touched but never understood. This is the truth Sidious feared but never named. Not power for its own sake, not freedom from chains, but the return. The knowledge that every empire, every master, every rule is merely a veil stretched thin over the same black fire. It is the fire that devours the devourer, the hunger that outlasts the hungry. The Sith did not invent it. They are merely the latest mask it wears. When the rule of two was born, the black core smiled, for it knew what Bane did not, that one day there would be no apprentice, only master, one soul twisted so fully, so perfectly into the voice of the dark that no second would be needed. The final Sith, the living wound, not a dynasty but a convergence, a storm not of thunder but of memory, one whose thoughts were the screams of millennia, one who did not obey the voice but became it. That dream nearly became flesh in Sidious. He reached for the core with both hands. He bent time, bent death, bent the force itself. But he was still a man, still mortal, and the black core does not suffer mortals long. It let him rise, it let him fall, it let him return, and then it let him die. For he had built an empire, yes, but not an altar. He did not kneel, he demanded. And in the end, the dark does not serve the proud. It consumes them. But the core is not finished. It cannot finish, because the force has no end. And its shadow, like all shadows, waits only for the light to flicker. The Jedi, weary and scattered. The galaxy adrift once more. The scars of war. Unhealed, the dark finds cracks. And from those cracks, the voice rises again, not as thunder, not as war, but as invitation. It will not roar this time. It will whisper to those abandoned, to those angry, to those who feel the force, but do not feel welcome in its light. And in that whisper, the rule of two becomes prophecy once more. Two truths, two eternities, one to rise, one to fall. The master dies, the apprentice survives. But what if the master never dies? What if the apprentice never leaves? What if they merge not in hate, not in betrayal, but in hunger? That is the future the black core dreams of. Not succession, not legacy. Convergence, a Sith with no name. A Sith who is all names. One who is Bane, Zana, Plagueis, Vader, not in memory, but in essence. He or she will not come with armies, will not build a throne. They will come with questions, with visions, with eyes that do not blink, and the Jedi will not see them. Not until it is far too late, because by then the voice will be inside them too. It always is. It was in Revan, it was in Anakin, it was in Luke, when he stood over his sleeping nephew with a saber in hand. It is in you, if you dare listen. The rule of two was never meant To last it was meant to summon, a beacon in blood, calling the shadow home. Now the beacon dims, the Sith are dead, but the voice is not. The black core spins, silent and sacred, in the heart of all conflict. And it dreams, it waits, it knows, and in your sleep you may feel it. In your doubt you may hear it, not as words, not even as feelings, but as certainty. You are not alone, you are watched, and the voice that once whispered to Bane, to Sidious, to Vader, may one day whisper to you, sleep now, for when you wake, it may be your turn to listen. Thus ends the entire history of the rule of two to fall asleep to.